Streetlights glowing over empty avenues in the dead of Arctic night. An automated system still performing its task for pedestrians who will just never come. Heating pipes that are pumping warmth at a cost of $7 million annually through apartment buildings, with one inhabitant. In certain neighborhoods, spray-painted messages mark crumbling walls. People live here. Desperate signals left by residents who have long since actually fled. And with that, welcome to Vorkuta, ladies and gents, Russia's largest ghost city. At its peak, back in 1989, over 115,000 people actually called this place home as a city 1,900 kilometers from Moscow that sits so far above the Arctic Circle it recorded, wait for it, minus 52 degrees Celsius, which is among the coldest temperatures in European history. Miners came here chasing wages that made them wealthy by Soviet standards, enduring a place where car engines freeze solid and blizzards can kill you just meters from your front door. Today, the census records around 50,000 residents, though officials quietly suggest that the reality is far lower than that. What makes Vorkuta different from every other dying city, though, is that it was really never supposed to exist, or not like this anyway. It was a Gulag camp where 2 million prisoners passed through and 200,000 died, 1 in 10 not leaving alive. They built everything here atop permafrost and mass graves. Then the Soviet Union recruited workers with promises that it couldn't keep, trapping them in the same frozen hell, just without the barbed wire this time. Now those promises are dead, and Vorkuta is returning to what it always was, a place that just rejects human habitation. Vorkuta sits so far above the Arctic Circle that it endures extremes even other Arctic settlements find remarkable. This isn't the picturesque Scandinavian Arctic of fords and northern light tourism. No, it's the kind of cold that turns exposed skin to frostbite in just minutes and creates a landscape where survival becomes a daily struggle for just much of the year. Average midwinter temperatures hover around minus 20 degrees Celsius, with more than 50 days each year below minus 30. They have a special kind of blizzard here called Purgus that periodically shuts down the city completely in whiteout conditions that are so severe that residents string rope lines between buildings to avoid becoming lost in the storm. Summer offers a little bit of reprieve, but they're mild and they're short, with the average temperature being 13 degrees Celsius. Which is not very nice. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's not very much. It's definitely jumper weather. The sun itself becomes something of an unreliable presence here, given how extreme the shift between seasons is due to being so far north. For part of December, the sun doesn't even come over the horizon, plunging the city into a polar night where the brightest light they experience is an after-sunset dusk. The absence of daylight here tests the human body both mentally and physically, as we have simply evolved to be exposed to sunlight and largely base our days around being awake when the sun shines and being asleep when it doesn't shine. It's a cycle that you're probably familiar with. Then, in late May through mid-June, the complete opposite effect kicks in. Once again, Vorkuta's extreme north location means that the Earth's tilt says that the sun doesn't set. It circles endlessly above the horizon in what's called the midnight sun. These extremes really do make Vorkuta feel less like a city and more sort of an experiment in human adaptability, where everyone's just pushed to their limits. Isolation compounds these extremes into something approaching total separation from the external world. No road connects the city to the rest of Russia. The sole year-round connection to the outside world comes via a single rail line built in 1941, which takes more than 40 hours to reach Moscow as it crawls through the Ural Mountains and across the endless northern reaches where human settlements are shockingly few and far between. Although, is it so shocking? It sounds horrible up here. Vorkuta does have an airport, which is the much preferred method of transportation over the nearly 2-day train journey, though these flights, which only occur a few times per week, only operate during the good weather season and can be cancelled at a moment's notice due to changing weather conditions, an all too common condition when blizzards make even Arctic-hardened pilots refuse to fly. Now, the cold dictates just about every aspect of daily life that would seem absurd or impossible just about anywhere else. When temperatures drop below -30, everyday items simply stop working the way that they're designed to. This is felt strongest with car batteries whose chemical reactions slow to a crawl that make them just essentially useless. Even if you could get the battery jumped, it wouldn't do you much good because in this climate, the motor oil in the car is so thick that the engine just wouldn't turn over. Vorkuta's solution to this involves a complex combination of survival technologies that residents have slowly adapted to over the years. Heated garages are something of a premium in the city, making starting the car a breeze in the mornings compared to the alternative approaches. For those less well-off, plug-in engine heaters serve to keep the car warm enough to start in severe frost, which can be seen in winter by the plethora of extension cables running out of buildings. Batteries remain the weakest link, their capacity collapsing in deep cold, which keeps locals busy with jump starts and replacements throughout the winter months. Inside the buildings, the cold wages a slower but equally relentless campaign. The doors to apartments routinely freeze shut overnight, making just getting outside a struggle. If ice in your country builds up on the outside of windows, in Russian Vorkuta it builds up on the inside as well. Even with radiators going full blast around the clock, it is just that f***ing cold. The cold's impact creates one of Vorkuta's starkest economic paradoxes. Above-ground heating pipes snake through the city like exposed arteries, delivering hot water to buildings where only a handful of residents remain, or in many cases, to structures that are just completely empty. The government spends an estimated 570 million rubles annually maintaining heat flow through approximately 15,500 vacant apartments, a seemingly absurd expenditure, until you understand the alternative. If these pipes were allowed to cool and the water inside them to freeze, the expanding ice would rupture the infrastructure entirely, transforming a costly maintenance burden into a catastrophically expensive reconstruction project that would render entire neighborhoods permanently uninhabitable. The system must run not because people need the heat in every building, but because the Arctic itself has taken the city hostage. I mean, if you shut down the flow to save money on empty apartments, then you guarantee the destruction of the network that keeps occupied ones warm, leaving the remaining residents to freeze in buildings that can no longer be heated at any cost, which is not brilliant. Daily tasks that you might carry out without a second thought, dear audience member, become elaborate productions here. Grocery shopping transforms into a race against time as milk and eggs will freeze solid during a walk home if they're not properly insulated. They literally have to put eggs in their coats. Children growing up here absorb survival knowledge that would sound paranoid anywhere else. Don't touch metal with your bare hands, or your hand will get frozen to it and risk tearing off chunks of your flesh. This is what life in Vorkuta actually means. It's not just enduring cold as an inconvenience, but inhabiting a city that exists in a state of permanent siege where the environment dictates terms and residents simply adapt or they leave. The cold doesn't merely make life harder here, it fundamentally redefines what's possible, turning basic existence into an engineering problem that requires constant vigilance, substantial resources, and a kind of resignation that comes from knowing the battle can never truly be won, only prolonged through another brutal winter, and then another, until the money runs out, the heating fails, or you finally escape. Okay, so we'll forgive you if by this point you're asking yourself why on earth anyone would come to this place and decide, yes, here is where we need to build not just a city, but a city with over a dozen mini satellite cities surrounding it. This wasn't a place that's been inhabited for hundreds of years or thousands of years by natives who'd grown hardened to the cold. This is a relatively new city dating back to a single discovery in 1930 that set everything in motion. Georgy Chernov was in the area surveying the desolate tundra along the Vorkuta River for what Stalin's rapidly industrializing empire desperately needed. Rich coal deposits lying beneath the permafrost in quantities that could fuel factories, steel mills, and the machinery of war. You know, in case war was on the cards. Spoiler alert, it was. Within a year, the decision had been made. The coal here was simply too abundant to pass over, and the Union was going to extract it one way or another, regardless of the human cost. One thing that the Union did have an abundance of at the time was prisoners who were so numerous that they could be shipped here en masse with little concern for their well-being, worked until they were either dead or dying, and then replaced by a fresh wave from Stalin's purges. The Soviet Union, everybody. In May 1931, the first group of roughly 40 prisoners, accompanied by geologists and armed guards, trekked north from Vorkuta through hundreds of kilometers of trackless wilderness to establish what would become one of the most notorious camps in the Gulag system. They formed the settlement of Rudnik in 1932, many having to sleep in crude huts initially, given that the construction of insulated barracks couldn't keep pace with the flood of new prisoners arriving by train from across the Soviet Union. This was the Gulag, or the Vorkuta Corrective Labor Camp, which would officially operate for the next 3 decades between 1932 and 1962, and eventually sprawl to encompass no fewer than 50 subcamps all over this coal-rich region. During this time, an estimated 2 million people passed through the Gulag's gates, and approximately 200,000 perished there, roughly 1 in 10 never leaving alive. The journey north itself claimed untold numbers, given that Soviet prison transports were not exactly first-class conditions, and the long ride left many exposed to the unforgiving elements that they were simply unable to withstand. The composition of the Gulag's population reflected the full spectrum of Stalin's paranoia: political prisoners branded enemies of the people, ethnic minorities swept up in mass deportations, and ordinary citizens arrested for knowing the wrong person. By 1938, the camp held around 15,000 inmates. Just a decade later, the number had surged to over 60,000, making it one of the largest Gulag complexes in the entire Soviet system. The prisoners built everything here. They laid the railroad through the Arctic wilderness that connected the mines to civilization, erected the mine shafts that descended into the permafrost, constructed the processing plants and barracks and guard towers, and hewed millions of tons of coal from underground chambers. These were done in standardized 12-hour shifts in hazardous conditions that all too often became death sentences when methane pockets exploded without warning, inadequate clothing allowed frostbite to set in, when temperatures plunged below -30, or when food rations calculated to keep prisoners just functional enough to work finally proved insufficient to sustain life. Yet these workplace deaths, as horrific as they were, at least carried the pretense of industrial accident. The camp authorities reserved their most deliberate cruelty for those who broke the rules or attempted escape. Punishments for escape attempts or rule violations were designed to maximize suffering. Inmates would be stripped naked and thrown into unheated solitary confinement cells during the polar night, where temperatures inside dropped low enough to cause frostbite within minutes. Most didn't make it to morning. This machinery of death reached its full operational capacity during World War II, when Vorkuta's strategic importance transformed individual tragedy into industrial-scale slaughter. Vorkuta's coal became crucial to the Soviet war economy during the 1940s. Stalin took a personal interest in the camp as output soared, with annual production doubling between 1942 and 1943 as prisoners were literally worked to death to meet quotas. The slogan, "More coal for the motherland," was emblazoned on a building where it can still be seen today, a monument to the thousands who died providing that coal while being told that their suffering served the glory of the Soviet state, which I'm sure they felt fantastic about. It wasn't until the tail end of the war, though, that Vorkuta's true scale really began to take shape. What had started as a remote camp for political prisoners had transformed into a massive industrial operation, one that required more than just untrained forced labor to function at the capacity Stalin's war economy demanded. To supplement the prison population, Soviet authorities began recruiting engineers, skilled miners, and technical specialists. Free workers lured north with promises of salaries that were significantly above the Soviet average, newly built apartments, and regular vacations to warm Black Sea resorts, all in the name of serving the communist revolution. Within a few years, tens of thousands of volunteers and we emphasize the uncertainty around just how voluntary these positions truly were. These volunteer civilians were living in Vorkuta alongside the 60,000 prisoners, creating a surreal society where free families lived in comparative comfort and luxury, mere blocks from the camps where their neighbors worked under conditions designed to extract maximum labor before death made replacement necessary. This uncomfortable arrangement persisted into the 1950s until Stalin's death triggered one of the largest uprisings in Gulag history, a strike that lasted weeks and only ended when Soviet troops opened fire, killing no fewer than 53 prisoners whose bodies were buried in unmarked graves now marked by wooden crosses on the tundra. Within a few years, Khrushchev's government enacted amnesties and reforms, most political prisoners were released, and the camp began to shrink. By 1962, the Gulag was officially closed after 3 decades of operation. But the Union still needed coal, which remained in abundance here. The Soviet state performed something of a makeover for the city. It had already been recruiting people to come here of their own volition, living alongside the prisoner population. After 62, it merely ramped up recruitment with aggressively expanded benefits designed to make people forget what the city was actually like. During the boom years of the 60s and 70s, there were multiple flights to Moscow each day, allowing miners to finish their shifts and spend long weekends in the capital with earnings that made them wealthy. The city acquired grand Stalinist architecture, including the Palace of Culture for Miners completed in 1961, and apartment buildings sprouted across the landscape. By the late 70s, Vorkuta's population had swelled above 100,000, with Soviet planners imagining a future where 250,000 people would call this frozen outpost home. The city that once symbolized Soviet power to conquer even the Arctic now stands as one of the most extreme examples of urban abandonment on Earth, where the official census claims 56,985 residents remain, though local officials quietly admit that the real numbers are, well, far lower than that. The gap represents people who maintain addresses for pension purposes while actually living, well, just about anywhere else that they can manage. The economics of survival in Vorkuta operate under a system that would be absurd anywhere else on Earth. The cold's impact creates one of Vorkuta's starkest economic paradoxes, all of that heating. For Vladimir Zaruk, who arrived from Ukraine in the 1970s chasing the high miners' wages that Vorkuta promised, this math has become personal in ways he never imagined when he was younger, and the Soviet system, however fragile, seemed eternal. His monthly pension arrives at 25,000 rubles, that's around $300, and after he pays for winter utilities, there's barely enough left for food, let alone escape. He applied for the government's resettlement program over a decade ago, yet despite this, he believes he is somewhere around number 6,000 on the waiting list to relocate out, with around 250 families per year being moved. At this rate, he jokes, he thinks he'll get out in just about another 120 years. Here in Vorkuta, where 15,000 people are eligible to relocate, most will die waiting for permission to leave at the current rates. Zaruk has become an activist in his retirement, founding a civic group that he named Hostages of the Far North, a phrase that captures what he and thousands like him have come to understand about their situation. They are prisoners of an economic trap, held hostage by poverty and a non-functional housing market. The deal was explicit when Zaruk arrived: endure the brutal conditions, accept the isolation and danger, but in return receive cheap housing and wages far higher than he could have hoped for elsewhere that could support a family, frequent vacations, and a trip out. Yet that social contract has been systematically broken, first during the collapse of the Soviet Union, then by decades of complete indifference from the Russian government. Beyond economics, daily life in Vorkuta has become something of a study in managed decline. The city, that once boasted over 30 medical facilities, now maintains just one main hospital, and when someone suffers a serious illness or injury requiring specialized care, they have to be medevaced either by train or by plane to Syktyvkar, 900 kilometers away through wilderness and cold, a trip that becomes impossible during the worst winter storms when medical evacuation means waiting for the weather to clear. It sometimes just comes down to hoping the patient survives long enough for clear weather to mean a window opens. The human cost here manifests in statistics that elsewhere would be shocking but have become pretty normalized in Vorkuta. Depression permeates the city, with suicide attempts spiking during the polar night when the sun refuses to rise for days on end. More common are the less obvious forms. Losing someone to either alcohol abuse or drugs has become grimly routine. One older resident shared that he lost his son to alcohol and his granddaughter to a drug overdose, tragedies he directly links on the lack of hope and purpose that young people have here. Against the darkness, there are actually some encouraging attempts to make the best of the situation. Russia is infamous for its vast expanses of dreary, grey brutalism buildings throughout much of the country. But this is actually not the case in much of Vorkuta and its satellites, where many are painted in almost aggressive shades of blue and yellow that serve both as navigation during blizzards while doubling as psychological warfare against despair in the never-ending cold. Really helpful, guys. Wow, yeah, it's freezing ass cold. Look at that beautiful, colorful building. F this. Support groups meet in Orthodox churches, soup kitchens operate for struggling families, and residents cling to small moments of normalcy wherever they can find them. The Palace of Culture stands as perhaps the most striking symbol of this defiance, an elaborate building constructed in 1961 when the city was thriving that still hosts events ranging from ballet to concerts. Inside this grand theatre, with its ornate stage and rows of velvet seats, you can still find children attending ballet classes beneath Soviet mosaics, a surreal image of grace and ambition persisting while the population outside dwindles year by year. This is what remains of Soviet ambition in the Arctic, a city barely kept alive by government subsidies that heat empty buildings populated by people too poor to leave and too stubborn to give up entirely, where every winter becomes a test of whether the will to survive can outlast the mathematics of abandonment. Yet if you think life in Vorkuta proper is grim, you haven't seen the settlements that ring it, the ghost towns where abandonment has already won. At Vorkuta's height, there were a total of 13 mining settlements that radiated outward from the main city like hours on a clock face, each one built around its own coal mine, complete with schools, clinics, cultural centers, and the full apparatus of Soviet urban planning. They were complete communities where thousands of families built lives, raised children, and believed that they were participating in building something permanent, something lasting. Spoiler alert, did last. When the coal flowed and Moscow's subsidies arrived on schedule, these settlements thrived with the kind of rough prosperity that frontier communities often achieve, higher than average wages, tight-knit communities, in spite of the enormously hostile environment all around them. Cracks were forming as the union began to decline in the 80s, though. By 1989, Vorkuta's miners were striking for better pay and conditions as the system was faltering around them, and the population that had peaked at 115,000 that year began to decline, and it would never reverse course again. These Arctic mines had never been economically self-sufficient. They existed out of economic necessity during the heyday of coal-fueled power, along with, especially in its earlier days, a place to put people where they wouldn't be seen or heard from again. The government had to pour enormous subsidies into keeping the city operational. When the union finally collapsed in 1991, it took those subsidies along with it. The transition, called shock therapy, was catastrophic across Russia. Hyperinflation wiped out savings overnight, and state services collapsed. But for Vorkuta, the crisis simply revealed what had always been true. These mines had never made economic sense. They existed not to fulfill some dire economic need in Russia's economy, but because the Soviet state originally needed somewhere to put its ideological prisoners where they could be at least somewhat useful. As the 90s progressed, the newly privatized mining companies looked at the actual cost of extraction versus the value of the coal and increasingly reached the conclusion that they should be closed. Many were shuttered by the early 2000s, a trend that has continued through to this day, each closure stripping away another settlement's reason for existence. The death of Vorkuta's satellite towns came quickly and without mercy. Mines closed, one after another throughout the decade, as the enormously bloated state-owned companies crumbled without the Soviet state propping them up. Their abysmal safety record wasn't exactly helping the cause either. Frequent injuries combined with occasional explosions, like one at Savannah mine in February 2016 that killed 36 miners and rescuers when methane gas ignited deep underground, forcing the permanent closure of what had been one of the last major operations. When your workers are dying in explosions just to extract coal that costs more to mine than it's worth, we think you can fill in the blanks on what comes next. Each mine closure meant something far more devastating than lost jobs. It meant the end of entire communities. These satellite settlements, places like Komsolovsky, Severny, and Vorkuta, existed for one reason only: to house the miners and their families near the pitheads. When the mines shut down, there was no alternative employment, no economic reason for anyone to stay, and critically, no justification for the government to continue maintaining the infrastructure that kept these Arctic outposts habitable. The exodus that followed wasn't a matter of choice, but a matter of survival. The departures were chaotic and traumatic, with some families escaping more easily than others. The government does offer a resettlement program for those who want to leave, but it's sluggish at best. Many wait years for approval while trapped in dying towns. Those who couldn't wait or couldn't get approval from the state to relocate at all simply packed what they could carry and headed south, leaving behind everything else. Families abandoned apartments with furniture, clothes, even family photos still inside, as if they intended to return, but they never did. What remains in these apartments shows what happens when Arctic cold invades habitable environments. Burst pipes have flooded entire floors, frozen to sheets of ice. Moisture has penetrated walls and frozen, expanding into plaster cracks and concrete crumbles. Unlike the outdoors, where cold can preserve things, the invasion of frigid temperatures into these buildings accelerates their destruction, making them completely uninhabitable. Officially, 3-room flats in settlements like Komsolovsky are listed for around 100,000 rubles, which is roughly $1,300 for purchase. I mean, I don't want to live there, but holy shit. Representing the absolute bottom of Russia's housing market, though even these rock-bottom prices reflect only the most desperate sales in buildings with failing utilities or mounting arrears. Yet even at these absurdly low prices, there are no buyers for apartments in these dying settlements. Some desperate owners have tried giving apartments away for a single ruble, yet even these bargain sellers struggle to find takers. There simply is not a market for people looking to live in crumbling, frozen ghost towns where entire communities have already fled and basic services are being systematically shut down. Outside the 5-story housing blocks that line ruins, you'll occasionally see chalk or spray-painted messages declaring people live here, or section inhabited, scrawled on walls by the last resident, desperate signals to utility workers not to shut off their heat or electricity. Most of these messages now mark entrances to buildings that are actually completely empty. The authors of that graffiti long since departed, their warnings preserved in fading paint as epitaphs for communities that no longer exist. Locals grimly refer to this constellation of settlements as the Ring of Death, and walking through them reveals why the nickname fits. The approach by train from the south captures the full scope of the devastation. As you crawl through 40 hours of journey from Moscow, the last stations before Vorkuta show you're leaving civilization behind. Then ghost towns begin appearing through the window, one after another, hulks of abandoned guard towers from the Gulag era still standing sentinel over settlements that no longer exist. The silence is really what hits you first, an absence of sound so complete that your own footsteps on frozen pavement feel like a violation. Then come the details that make the abandonment real. Take Komsomovsky, which once housed 20,000 people. When journalists from Radio Free Europe visited in 2021, they found a settlement that had shrunk to around 200 residents. The streets are illuminated by functioning streetlights that glow over empty avenues each night, an automated system still performing its duties for pedestrians who will never come. The buildings themselves tell the story of rapid abandonment, windows broken out from vandals, or the freeze-thaw cycle, doors hanging at odd angles, snow drifting into lobbies where mailboxes still bear the names of families who left a decade ago. The mine in this settlement still operates, and is the deepest in all of Russia at over 1,100 meters, but the workers don't live here anymore. They're bussed in daily from Vorkuta city proper, rather than living in the ghost town above. They descend into the earth each shift, extract coal from chambers deep below the permafrost, then return to the surface and board buses that carry them back to the marginally more inhabited main city. Severny tells a similar story, but with its own particular tragedy. 20,000 people once called this settlement home, until that February 2016 methane explosion killed 36 and forced the mine's closure. The population has since dwindled to around 3,600, mostly pensioners too poor to relocate, and workers in related industries still cling to what little work remains. Walk through apartment blocks, and you'll find the jarring contrast that makes up Vorkuta and its surroundings. Entire buildings that on first appearance look to be abandoned, with frost biting deep into the exposed units, until upon closer examination you'll find one unit with a light still on, the only sign of life in eyesight. Other settlements in the ring have crossed into the threshold of complete abandonment. When summer arrives and the snow melts, these settlements reveal what winter hides. Cracked asphalt emerging from beneath the ice, rusted playground equipment with swings buried in stagnant puddles, weeds pushing through pavement, graffiti on crumbling walls. In Vorkuta today, you will see proclamations of more coal for the motherland emblazoned on buildings, visible to anyone who passes by. It stands as a monument to the 200,000 prisoners who died being told their suffering served some greater purpose, that their sacrifices mattered. The slogan remains because no one has bothered to remove it, which seems fitting. Vorkuta has always been a place where the living coexisted with the dead, building their lives atop mass graves and pretending the foundations are not made of corpses. The 50,000 or so people who remain aren't staying because they believe in the city or think it has a future. They're staying because poverty and bureaucratic indifference have trapped them here. Some paint their buildings in bright colors and try and pass the time in the palace of culture. But these gestures can't change the fundamental thing that every year the population shrinks, and every year more pensioners die waiting for resettlement. What obligation does a state have to citizens it deliberately settled in impossible places, whether by force or by false promises? The Soviet Union built Vorkuta with prisoner labor, then recruited free workers with explicit guarantees of a better quality of living. In the end, Vorkuta reveals what happens when a state treats geography as an enemy to be conquered through willpower and expendable lives. Stalin's coal quotas were met, the machinery of war was fueled, but that purpose was always temporary, always built on the delusion that brutality could create something permanent in a place that fundamentally rejects human habitation. Thank you for watching.